Welcome back. This week we're going to talk about Europe. For many of you outside of North America, unless you're from another region or have extensively traveled or lived there, this tends to be the region that we're most familiar with, that we've heard the most news with. And again, this is because from coming from the United States, being a core nation, this is probably even, if I asked you of all the regions in the world where you would like to live, most people would mention this region. And this tends to be not necessarily more of our connections, but a lot more positive things about Europe would be on the news than necessarily from other countries. Culturally speaking, there's a lot more similarities. What I always find interesting when I do the mental maps in class, so, as you're doing them online with every region, I go and say, okay, what are the three countries, or what are three countries or areas that you wouldn't mind living in? People really have to think. You get to Sub-Saharan Africa, and some people are like, none. I wouldn't want to live in any of the countries. If you get to, the last region with Middle East, Southwest Asia, and Northern Africa, again, a lot of people are like, none. But if I ask for Europe, a lot of people have a difficult time saying which three countries that they would actually want to live in. A lot of people appear to be quite happy living in most of any country in this region. Okay, so I'm going to start off here with physical geography. These are just your, the summary again. So you have that. Glance back for your notes and studying. So Europe. Europe consists of 42 countries. You've done with your map this week, you'll notice that a lot of people aren't aware of how small, like Monaco is this little tiny town in south of France. You have Andorra, which is technically an independent country. There's a lot of, Liechtenstein, which is a country, Luxembourg. There's a lot of really little tiny, like, dot countries that are independent countries. And then we do have some that are, I forget the technical word for it. They're more like city-states, we call them, sorry. Vatican City, for example, is technically not a part. It's just it's a city, but it's its own state, being its own nation, inside the middle of Rome. What we refer to as the Vatican normally. You can see here on the map. Little tiny dot there. So relatively speaking, this is a very small region in the world, especially when we look at North America. We're talking about large continents, and yes, this is technically considered a continent within itself. Here you can see when we talked about last week, part of Turkey. So here's like the other side of Turkey, which is geographically speaking, from a plate tectonic perspective, physical perspective, it's part of Europe, but you can see because of the country status, it's still part of Southwest Asia and Northern Africa. This region is also characteristic because it's very densely settled, and realistically speaking, there is a strong shared history amidst a lot of cultural diversity. While this isn't necessarily the oldest region that's been civilized, this is, I think, when we think about countries and urbanization and cities, this region doesn't even have the oldest cities. But this is what a lot of us think of. And again, this would be a very Western, very American perspective, because a lot of people, the dominant majority race in our country, I shouldn't say dominant, the majority race in or predominant race in our country is still white. So the majority of people are white, and that largely influences mainstream perspectives. And that being, the first settlers of our current nation, our current state, came from Western Europe, Western Northern Europe. So there definitely is a perspective for most people, not for everybody, obviously, but for a lot of people, and from a mainstream level, this is what we see. So physical geography, one thing that we have seen in this region more than any other region is a long history of human settlement. long history and massive changes in landscape. Um, so there's a few other factors that also influence this region's environmental diversity. There's a very complex geology, and you can see, I like that this comparison they show you from the from over North America. So you can see it's much smaller in size. It's much smaller, and I don't think a lot of people realize just how small, even in population, compared to the U.S., a lot of these countries are. Um, but one thing that is very different regarding Europe, that's quite impressive, and this map definitely shows it as well, is what they call the latitudinal range. So southern Spain is as low as Arizona and or close to the Mexican border. And yet north of Scandinavia is up in the Arctic. You can see the subarctic areas. It's quite, quite north. So this huge range has a strong influence as well on, obviously, climate patterns. And we'll talk about that here. So some of the common landforms that we see that your book talks about, we've got the European lowland, which, a lot of us think of if you've been traveling around. There is a lot of lowlands especially in the western half of the continent, of the region. And this is a huge economic focus for Western Europe. A lot of agricultural activities go on in this region, a lot of specialized agricultural activities as well. And you can see these really cool patterns of glaciation, especially in like the low. If you've been to Scotland, and you've been to the Highlands, you can see how literally how the glaciers have receded with the last ice age, and they've basically just dragged across. It's really hard to imagine, but they've dragged across, and this with some other patterns in North America and on the eastern seaboard. They've dragged across and they've changed the landscape drastically, but they've also kind of, you're not going to see like rocky mountains and sharp peaks, in a lot of these areas. Obviously, the Alps would be a very different, example. Um, and then we also have the Alpine mountain range, or the mountain system, which a lot of people refer to specifically as the spine of Europe. Kind of provides this backbone that goes across mainland Europe. We've also got the central uplands. So again, I mean, we're talking about an area that it's not a lot of landmass, but it is spread out. So you get this older highland region, especially things like Scandinavia, sources of industrial raw materials. And even this board is kind of an example of like glaciation. You can see the glaciers have receded and changed the landscape. Western Highlands, the western part of Europe has the oldest mountain ranges. And again, this concept of the glaciated landscapes. And then, as we see here in Norway, this concept of a fjords. There have been, at previous points in time, there have been a landslide or a rock slide that causes a tsunami. And because of just the space of these riverways, there's nowhere for water to go, and it creates this tidal wave that has wiped out populations at times. Seas, rivers, and ports. So waterways are really important for Europe. And if you think about people, the early settlers and early Americans, their objective was to find a waterway that passed from one side of the country to another. And again, this is, you think, why would have this been so important, or why would this is something that they would have thought about? And this is coming from a European perspective, where the waterways are really important, and they were really important. Most of Europe, we think about canals, and if you've been to Amsterdam, you think of canals. If you've been to Venice, you think of canals. But realistically, most of Europe is what they're calling navigable. They're connected. Most of Europe is largely connected by systems of canals and locks in all countries, not just limited to the couple countries that we tend to associate this system of transportation with. And the countries are also the region is surrounded by 4 different seas, including the Atlantic Ocean. So it's a very water-based country. It's very region. It's a very maritime-based region. And when European countries, Netherlands as well as England, have been at times, or the British, um, sorry, I cannot speak tonight. I'm really sorry. Um, uh, oh, what? Sorry, Great Britain. I was really struggling there. So when these countries have been the hegemonic force of the world, you can go back. You can just, if you Wikipedia hegemonic forces in the world, you'll see the different time periods. But at different times, a lot of who has been able to maintain power has largely been associated with their maritime skills and technology that was available to them. So water systems are really, really important. This is an example. Here is an example of the Danube, which is a river that runs through several countries. This is actually a really good example of ecosystem restoration and rehabilitation. That a lot of progress has been made throughout a variety of countries. Climate. So again, you can see climate goes from, it's amazing, but we've got polar climates, tundra, up on the very top northern areas. And then we've got Mediterranean climates. We even have subtropical steppe in parts of Spain. So the climates are vastly different. You can see rainfall is pretty much similar throughout. And temperatures do vary, but again, we're seeing much, since it's somewhat parallel. So if you want to kind of get a reference here to, if you are from, so 45-degree parallel runs right through here. Portland, Oregon is just north of the 45-degree parallel. We here in Honolulu are about 21 degrees north of the equator, so about 21 north is our parallel. So there's three major climate types. We have the marine west coast, continental, and Mediterranean. So again, a lot of this area down here is going to be largely influenced by the Mediterranean Ocean or Sea. The marine west coast. Now, a lot of this climate here is actually influenced by this North Atlantic current. So there's the Gulf Stream, we would call it too, which is coming from the Mexican Gulf down here, the Gulf of Mexico, and it comes up. And it creates not only this very moist and wet climate, but it also keeps the climate mild. If not, we would see an expansion and we'd see this very cold area coming down further than it does. And then continental, so we obviously see these regions which are less influenced by the sea areas, and then you're getting more influences here from the continental areas. So some environmental issues we see. This region, as I mentioned, has a very long history of agricultural, manufacturing, and urbanization. We talk about manufacturing, industrialization being these huge factors involving development, but they're also huge factors that have led to a lot of ecological impacts. And these are huge motivators and huge factors that have largely influenced and shaped this landscape, the human landscape, cultural landscape, as well as the natural landscape. I remember learning about this case of a moth in Great Britain. Now, at the time of the Industrial Revolution, they were using coal. The coal was, there was certain types of technology were invented so that we could burn coal, and there were no environmental regulations. Obviously, we didn't know about all of the contaminants and pollutants that were being produced by burning coal. But you were getting this black soot coming out, and there were these moths, and it was the same species, and some were white and some were black. Well, the trees, it was the birch trees, were white, so the white moths had a lot more natural habitat areas to use their camouflage and not be detected by birds and therefore not be eaten. So the black moths were not as predominant. With the Industrial Revolution, and you had the soot being released, you can even go see in a lot of these buildings. Edinburgh is a good example. A lot of these countries, but you can see these buildings where they look black. Edinburgh, if you've ever been to Edinburgh, it's a really great example of this because the buildings are black. But it's not that they're black stone. They were actually previously a very light stone, but the accumulation of soot over hundreds of years, realistically speaking, has changed the color of the buildings. And the same happened everywhere. We're talking about trees, we're talking about all different surfaces. And as what happened was over time, we actually saw a shift in this moth. And this is nothing new. This is something that happened well over 100 years ago. But all of a sudden now the landscape is becoming darker. Buildings, trees, these white trees, because they're becoming contaminated with this soot that's being produced by burning the coal. And now the black moths actually had a place to hide due to their color and was providing a camouflage. And the white moths now stuck out. And there was this huge shift in the population where the moth eventually started becoming black because the white ones were picked off. I don't know about the current state of the moth. I read about this case a really long time ago. But that's just one example of kind of understanding over periods, long periods of time. We've even seen shifts in colors of animal species because of this long history of manufacturing and urbanization. And I actually have to say, when I spent some time in the UK a couple of years ago, I was really impressed with there's a level of something I don't see here. They're trying to create natural habitats for certain species within cities. So this was, I think it was a falcon species, and there was a natural habitat. And what they have found is that this is a program I was watching on the BBC, and they've managed to put these cameras in these nests. And what they were showing was that how they have managed to create a habitat for these species inside the cities. And interestingly enough, is what they actually found by creating these habitats for this falcon, which is a predatory bird. This bird would hunt pigeons, rats, mice, and other things we don't necessarily associate with a big city, but depending on where you've lived, you know that cities are often plagued by these, especially pigeons, right? Most of us don't necessarily think about rats, unless you maybe lived in New York or even around here on Island, right? So there's this really interesting movement that's been happening to kind of try and recreate habitat for species, but even within urbanized areas. And yet, despite all of the changes that we've seen and the long history and the drastic changes in landscape, so if we want to talk about original forest cover that existed, it's virtually nothing today. Yet it's a very green region, and there has been a lot of efforts to recreate green spaces or forests, even though they might not be native species. But there has been a lot of effort in previous decades. So some of the other environmental problems that we're talking about here, global warming, obviously the same thing, and normally we refer to it as climate change, right? But climate change, part of that climate change is global warming. We used to call it global warming, and so we want to talk about climate change. We actually, as a broader concept, we still do need to call it climate change. But global warming is warming temperatures that have caused specific issues and are a symptom of climate change, if you will say. A couple of other things that we're seeing, and again, a lot of this is related to climate change. Dutch coastlines. So the country of Holland, or the Netherlands, is actually below sea level. I'm trying to think if there's any parts of it. I know the majority of the country, if not all of it, is technically below sea level. And they have this really awesome system of windmills and dikes which pump the water out and put it into canals. So these man-made canals. However, the fact that the whole country is already under sea level and we're expecting water levels to rise, sea levels to rise, this is a continual problem. And you can actually see all of the areas up here along the North Sea and Baltic Sea. These are all areas that are vulnerable to sea level rise. And then finally, they're talking about acid precipitation. We tend to call acid rain. And this is through generations and generations of burning coal, and a lot of countries still being dependent on coal as well. And you do see a lot of air pollution is also, polluted rivers, a lot of these other problems You can actually see the areas that are purple are areas affected by acid rain or acid precipitation. So a huge part of this country, or this region, I'm sorry. So some other effects of climate change that we're seeing, so those specifically associated with global warming, again, a lot of the negative consequences we're seeing in a lot of places. So we're seeing less sea ice, which will affect the northern areas, melting glaciers. So this is will also largely affect the Alps, rising sea levels, as we just mentioned. And then we're also seeing more frequent droughts. And with that, we're seeing more frequent heat spells, especially in more southern countries, Mediterranean countries, Spain and Portugal, where it already gets quite hot and there have been extensive droughts. This is being exacerbated even more. However, on a pro side, we have seen some attempts at international collaboration to reduce the impacts of climate change, such as the Kyoto Protocol. If you've never read about it, you've never heard about it, might have been before your time, but I definitely recommend going and reading about it. For the most part, it was largely unsuccessful, much is what will most likely happen with the Paris deal. Um, I find, I don't want to sound pessimistic, but I think we need to be realistic. And these are great efforts and attempts, but it's just not enough to curb climate change. And actually, in the latest research, um, there's a lot of more contemporary research where they're suggesting, if you've heard anything about it, they used to say we can't get above 300 parts per million of carbon molecules, for example, and then our greenhouse gas emissions per the parts per million. And then it became a few years later, we can't get above 350. If we get above 350 parts per million, there's no going back. And I think it was within like a matter of months. It was, oh crap. I'm pretty sure we've now broken 400. There is a website that was around the 300, 350 time period that was, I think it's called 350.org, and it's a climate change organization that tries to make efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But so what I'm trying to get at is we've gone past the point where we can stop this. And most scientists now are accepting that. And obviously it takes longer from science to media to mainstream to discourse, everyday discourse. But one of the things of it is that we need to move beyond prevention, because there is no preventing it. We need to talk about mitigation and adaptation. How are we going to deal with these impacts? It's not a matter of if or not, whether or not we're going to have the impacts of climate change. We've already have them. They're here. They're going to get worse. So we're at a point now where we need to talk about how we're going to mitigate them, how we're going to control them, and how we're going to adapt to this new reality and the reality that is going to continue coming. A couple other things that are, again, associated with like the Kyoto Protocol. So we have seen generally in this region declining coal resources. We've also seen declining uses of coal. However, there still is a heavy reliance on imported gas and oil. And if you remember looking at when we talked about Southwest Asia and Northern Africa, where the oil reserves, try and think of that graph, where the oil and natural gas reserves were. Not in this region. None of these countries are a member of OPEC. And there has been a lot of policy to increase renewable energy resources. You get these wind farms located off the coast. It's quite common. Netherlands, I believe France as well, the UK, Scotland, Germany. So there is a lot more focus switching to wind power. And then the EU actually also has an emission trading scheme, and it is the most successful in the world. So I think I've mentioned before, I used to do work on a biofuels project, and one of the things was understanding this like carbon trading. So this is what we call emission trading scheme. Basically, it's putting a cap on how much countries and businesses are allowed to produce regarding greenhouse gas emissions. And what they can do is if businesses and countries can expend less than that, so produce less, then they can basically sell their credits. So another country and company can then buy those credits, and they can produce more. But then generally what you've seen is that there's just an overall reduction. And part of the scheme was that over time, there was supposed to be a continual reduction. So this year, let's just say it's kind of like musical chairs, if you will. You've got 30 chairs, you've got 30 shares. This is lowballing it drastically. And then in a couple years or after the first round, now we've got one less. So that kind of gives you an idea, and it's supposed to get to a certain point where it was able to reduce the carbon emissions to a certain previous point. That's like with the Kyoto Protocol, it was supposed to go back to 1990 emission levels, which obviously didn't work out. Okay, I'll go ahead and stop here, and have a great week. Let me know if you have any questions.